So today is Pentecost Sunday. Today we look again back at this mysterious event at the start of the book of Acts. Keep in mind that the disciples have just recently witnessed their teacher and friend and Messiah get arrested, abused, and killed before their eyes. They've witnessed his return from death and his ascension. They've gone from hope over the course of this story. They've gone from hope to despair and now back to hope again. But it's a different kind of hope than what they had before. Their hope now lies in something they could not even have imagined up until this point in their lives. Their hope lies in a crucified Messiah. The world, the story leading up to this moment, their own identity and lives have been completely overturned and transformed in light of these recent events. These women and men are now gathered together in Jerusalem at the time of the annual celebration of Pentecost, the Feast of the Harvest, trying to make sense of it all and move forward. A huge crowd of Jews has gathered in the city to observe and celebrate this holiday. People have traveled from far and wide, from across and outside the Roman Empire, to express their devotion. And Luke, the writer of a gospel and of the story that follows in the wake of that gospel, sets the stage for this part of the story with this ominous passage in the opening verses of chapter 2 of Acts. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. The disciples are together, and then the air begins to move around them. The shutters are shuddering. The door is shaking in its frame. Their clothes are rustling. Dust and wind move through the house. The volume rises. And they stop talking because they can't even hear themselves think anymore. The Spirit, the same breath, wind of God that swept over the waters in the moments after God brought the cosmos into being from nothing, that same Spirit is now sweeping over creation again. The disciples must be wondering, especially given what they've already seen, what in the world will happen next? Now, skip to the end of the passage. Peter explaining himself, in a sense, to the crowd of baffled listeners. He repeats the ancient words of a Jewish prophet. And I will show portents in heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. These are the words of the prophet Joel, written centuries prior to the events described in Acts. Words of God's power and judgment. Words indicating not just local but cosmic power, catastrophic, earth-shattering power. Now imagine we're all first century Jews. We've grown up hearing these words. In each of our imaginations, an awesome scene has been painted. Light and darkness, blood and fire and smoke. The sun's light snuffed out like a candle flame. And our solar system cloaked in inky shadow. When we hear this kind of language, I imagine most of us think of world-ending calamity, civilizations torn apart, cosmic rupture and upheaval. We have always wondered, when we hear this passage, what great and marvelous events might these words refer to? All this is the background and the setup for this passage in Acts. Now let's hear this story again. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at the sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They're filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning." I always find that passage funny. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Why would we be drunk? No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. "In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. And your young men shall see visions. And your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit. And they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Now, when we read this story again, this story that every good Church of Christer should have stamped into their consciousness and memorized, it's easy to get distracted by the wind and the flames, the tongues of fire. When we imagine the scene, I'm guessing that's the thing that most of us have in our heads. But when we do that, we miss the real miracle here, the real point of the story. The world-changing, earth-shattering power lies not in the power of the wind or the flames hovering over the disciples' heads, but in what the Spirit does through the disciples here. We might tend to think that the point of the story is to see how the disciples obtain or are filled with the Spirit of the Lord. We do see that happen. But notice that although Luke could have ended the story there, he didn't. That's just the setup for the story. The point of the story is not so much that the disciples are drawn into the power and life of the Spirit of God, but that all these others are. People from across the world, Jews and proselytes, former pagans who were drawn to the story of God's covenantal relationship with Israel. In this story that draws on the words of the Hebrew prophets, who told of the kinds of acts of God that reveal the character and intentions of God. In this story in Acts, which Luke intends to help give us a sense, not only of the character of this community of disciples, but of who this God is that they worship. This is the story that he tells. The great deed of power, the earth-shattering event that reveals who God is and what God cares about. The deed that reveals the nature of real power, that rends the world, turns out to be God's enactment of a community without borders. What's turned upside down and destroyed is the world as it was. The world that's defined by class and status and national boundaries and skin color and gender. Notice that in the immediate wake of this quotation from Joel, what we hear is not that God brought life and light to an end. What God has torn down is the lifeless world as it was. And what follows? Peter tells us, in the wake of God's astounding work, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. The emphasis here, given the context, is on that first word, everyone. This is a story about inclusion and welcome and hospitality. What happens when the Spirit is at work is the expression of a message and the creation of a community, not just for those who look like me, who fall into my social status or rank, who have the same shade of skin that I do. Everyone is invited. And so the Spirit of God hovers over a new kind of reality, a community that locates its identity in a crucified Messiah, and which therefore seeks not to harm others or divide, isolate from, tear down, or dominate, but to turn the other cheek, to rejoice in suffering, to reconcile, to bring light where there is darkness, and love where there's hatred, and peace where there's violence. A world that's built around the love of God and the love of neighbor. As the story in Acts proceeds from here, we see the same thing from another angle or in a different way. We see this community grow and unite and share a table of fellowship together. Even though they come from so many different places and backgrounds, they share their bread with each other like a family. And that community has now extended not only across the face of the planet, but down through time, so that we too can sit at that table alongside them, all proclaiming with one voice that the source and center of our lives is this crucified and risen Messiah. In His name we gather to be sustained again with real food and real drink. And we are renewed by the same Spirit that was at work among the earliest disciples. This same Spirit fills us and binds us together and sends us out to be the living sacrifice that is Christ's body. So, come to the table. Let's pray. God, we thank you for all the good things that you give us. We pray that you would tear down our hatred, our division, our apathy, our malice, and give us instead a reconciling spirit, a loving spirit, a peaceful spirit. We thank you that you have brought us into your own life and light. We pray that you would fill us with your Spirit and bind us together, empower us to be the living sacrifice. We pray all through Christ our Lord. Amen.